Presentation, and thank you all for framing it so well. And we have about an hour or so, so please, when you phrase your question, if you would kindly mention your name at the same time and indicate which of the speakers you're directing the question towards. Who would like to start?
Well,
Please.
I'm a nobody, Pam Martin. Just this idea of genocide, is the underlying reason for genocide threat?
Depends what you mean by threat. People perceive threats where there aren't any. I'm wary of that term because I think it's very easily misused. I mean, it can too easily serve as an excuse. I mean, the United Kingdom apparently at the moment is under threat from waves and waves and millions of refugees from around the world. I suspect that because basically that sort of language has now been co-opted, it's probably better to avoid it. But behind your question, I think there's something really important. Now, of course, I have no better an idea than anybody else. Why on earth do people do these things? And I haven't a clue. None of us have, because presumably, if it were properly understood, we could do something about it. Human beings are all things.
Can I also say something about this? Part of one of the issues in scholarship about genocide, and not just the Armenian genocide, but genocides in general, is this question of explanation and understanding. And the fear among some people that explaining an event is a form of justifying it. And in the case of the Armenian genocide, understanding the sort of mind frame of the perpetrators, and in particular the leadership, the Young Turk leadership of Talat Jamal and Enver Pasha, the defense minister, understanding their mentality and the people they worked with is somehow then going to provide a justification. And it's important to see that there was a threat. The Ottoman Empire was under a lot of pressure at the time, especially the threat from Russia. And it was an existential threat. So if you study the history, you know that the empire was disintegrating over a period of time. And there was this fear of this internal threat of the Armenians. Now, clearly that doesn't justify a genocide, but talking about it makes people sometimes uncomfortable. And that's why I think it's important when I do my work in Turkey to acknowledge the truth about what happened and the fact that, yes, there was some armed resistance, but it was an armed resistance in defense of possible extermination. There was a threat by Russia at the time. All these factors. So you don't want to present a sort of monolithic explanation of what happened, just like the deniers do in their explanation, that the Armenians were revolutionaries, they were undermining the empire, and they had to be dealt with, and the way they were dealt with was unfortunate.
Please, yes.
My name's Joanne, and thank you very much for both the talks, really interesting. I'd just like to quickly ask for a really potted opinion from each of you of why Turkey has denied this for 100 years. What is the main motivation throughout its changes as a country? What's the main motivation for them still to deny it?
Because the primary, I mean, there are a lot of explanations one can give, but it's really attacking the foundational myth of the Turkish Republic. Let me just stand. Part of what happened with the fall, and it's often people say, well, that was the Ottoman Empire. The Republic was founded in 1923. You know, you could say that they weren't culpable. But unfortunately, the Republic was founded upon this event of the erasure of minorities within the empire. And how that transition from the empire to the Republic took place was that many of the important leaders in the early nationalist movement had dirty hands from the time of the Young Turks. Not all of them, and obviously in the case of Mustafa Kemal, he was not involved in any of the genocidal acts. But at the end of the Ottoman Empire, there was this attempt to bring justice to what had happened, and there were military trials took place right at the end of the war. But again, because of the occupation of Turkey, there was this backlash, and the backlash was the nationalist backlash that resulted in the founding of the Republic. So it's like what Americans have to deal with. We have to deal with the creation of our republic, and part of it was not just the breaking with Britain, but was the suppression and eradication and genocide of Native Americans. And it was something that it took us many years to acknowledge, and we still don't use the word genocide to describe what happened to Native Americans. So part of it is really the foundational myth of the Turkish Republic. And it goes right at the core of that myth about the fact that we had that Turkey had this sort of pure beginning. And it wasn't all that pure. There were many perpetrators involved in the Republic. And then the policies of the Republic against the Kurdish minority, who became the inheritors of these lands that were both Kurdish and Armenian, again, instantiates this sort of use of state violence against groups that do not conform to the image of what a Turk must be. So we find persecutions of the Kurds that happened in the decades after, and the use of violence to create a Turkish identity.
Yeah, I mean, let me just add to that. I mean, I think it would be a mistake to sort of think that there's something exceptional about the Turkish-Armenian case.
Yeah.
I mean, all nations are founded in myth, and any challenge to myth is going to be a problem. I think it's just as simple as that. I think you're right. You look at the foundational myths of all sorts of countries around the world. There's an enormous investment in keeping to those myths. And if you want to be pessimistic about it, you may well suppose that the existence and furtherance of nations, nation states, is always going to carry with it the threat of genocide. Because to be a nation state, you have to be different from some other bunch of people. And if you have to be different from some other bunch of people, then it follows that they have to be different from you. And if they're different from you, it's a problem. So I think there's a lesson here about the dangers of nationalism.
Gerhard, could I? Your question.
I'm Gerhard from Gerhard from Sussex University. A question for Professor Marsobian. Is there any, I mean, I found it very interesting how you talk about bringing these exhibitions back to Turkey in a way and engaging with the local whatever community and people who are living now in these houses, for example. Is there any material aspect to this discussion about the genocide in terms of property, houses, getting property back? Or is it, in a way, are we not there yet? Because in a way, accepting that this was a genocide, accepting that this was a crime, in a way has implications, not just moral implications, but actually material implications as well. Or are we, in a way, too far away from this discussion, but it will be a discussion that we will probably have in whatever, a few years' time?
Yeah, I think that in many ways we're too far away from it, but it's not to be forgotten. I think that the question of reparations is not something that can be ignored. The question is, obviously, you're not going to be able to restore what was lost, but there are forms of symbolic reparations that could involve returns of certain properties to the Armenian community. And in particular, there are events going on now that reflect some of that in Turkey. Just this week, Camp Armen, which was a camp that was owned by the Armenian Protestant community and was appropriated by the Republic, has been restored to the Armenian Protestant community in Istanbul. In terms of individual personal property, I've always been very careful and made it clear that there was a mutual loss with regard to my family. So I'm not interested in recovering that particular property in Merzifon. Unfortunately, a lot of people come to former Armenian properties and claim that they knew the former owners, they know where the gold is, and they want to use it for their own selfish purposes. But those are not the Armenian diasporans. Those are local, usually Kurds and Turks, who are interested in benefiting by claiming that they have some knowledge about the property. But with regard to the question of property in general, I think we're not there yet. But the important thing is that I think for ultimately justice to be served, there has to be some form of reparation. And it will involve as much communal properties and recognition of those properties. But it won't involve individuals having some compensation for the loss. Part of it is that it's just so difficult to be able to determine who owns what over those years. Much of those records are lost.
Sybil Oldfield, I just wanted to ask a question about your story of the family. I understood that they were deported to Greece in 1922, is that right?
Yeah.
But how did they escape the ox carts in 1915? I didn't follow that.
I didn't mention it. That was by conversion to Islam, which was a family secret that wasn't told to my generation. It was something that I discovered only about 5 years ago in notebooks by one of my great aunts. My uncles were old enough and they remembered what had happened, but they had never talked about it. And my mother was too young to remember, so she didn't, I don't think she knew. But basically, my grandfather was needed by the military as a photographer, and he was being protected up to a certain point, and finally the commandant of the gendarmes said, every Armenian has to go except those that convert. And the family converted on August 10th, 1915. And in this account, in these journals, we have the names of their Turkish names they were given on that date. And then I verified them in Ottoman records, where there is a record of the Turkish names that these Armenians have. And in Merzifon, and this varied from city to city, in Merzifon there were a significant number of conversions, and they were predominantly in the Armenian Protestant community. Much to the chagrin of the American missionaries, who were very upset after all that work they did converting them from the apostolic faith to the Protestant faith. But in a town of 13,000 Armenians, there were about 1,200 converted Armenians by the end of the summer of 1915. Actually, there were many more, but the authorities further up, including Talat Pasha, got upset by the fact that there were too many Armenians converting to Islam to avoid the deportation. And that's a story many Armenians don't want to hear about, is that there were significant Armenians who, for obviously under threat, gave up their faith and didn't go on to be those martyrs that we often celebrate.
But they weren't saved by that in 1922.
No. In 1922, they were again given a choice, but it had to be, you couldn't maintain your Armenian identity. You had to take a Turkish identity at that particular time in that place. And they felt they had done that once before and they were not going to do it again. There wasn't a particular question of converting to Islam, but it was really giving up your Armenian identity, which again would be counter to everyone is a Turk. We're starting this republic as everyone is a Turk, and they couldn't. And they were also under threat because of the work they did with the Americans and in particular the English.
Yes, we've got time for one or two more.
Peter Stimson. I think your family's experience raises a crucial issue to my mind. Were the Armenians slaughtered because they were Armenian or because they were Christian? Now, in your definition, Bob, of genocide,
Wasn't a definition.
in your explanation of genocide, you said people who could not help but be something. That is one of the features of genocide. Armenians cannot help but be Armenian, but they could help not be Christian. And could they not save themselves from this
I think
by
that's
conversion to
radically
Islam?
unclear. I mean, your question is perfectly clear, but the thought is unclear because I don't think that I can say on behalf of such and such a, say, Christian, whether or not that's something that that person can give up. I hear people saying different things, and I think that is important. Now, it's a fluid sort of category. All these categories are going to be fluid, but I wouldn't want to generalise on other people's behalf. I mean, I know people who historically have given up a particular religious belief system. I know others who simply could not do that because that's who they were. I think we just have to respect both.
Could I just remind everyone of the obvious contrast with the Nazi campaign to eliminate all Jews, where conversion was absolutely insignificant. It was no defence whatsoever, and that does seem to be an important difference.
No, that's crucial because, quote, for the Nazis, being Jewish was a racial term, it wasn't a religious term. Hence, your grandparents and your great-grandparents and that sort of stuff.
Yep.
And of course, in that context, it's particularly complex.
There was a demographic campaign going on, and the idea was to reduce the Armenian population to 5% in the Sanja in Ottoman Turkey. So there was an acknowledgement that some Armenians could remain, but they could only remain as Turks and Islamized. And then they were identified by the importance of what they were doing in some of the areas. In some areas it was 100%, but there were in some places where they needed at least one mill operator. They needed one metal worker. Even though the deportation destroyed the economy in any case, but there was some rationality to this irrationality that was going on. And the identities were in many ways fluid. Many Armenians had converted years before. So it was unclear, but many Armenians were unwilling to give up their Christian identity. And in the case of my family, my grandmother and my great aunt said no, they didn't want to convert. And there was an argument in the memoirs about my grandfather arguing with his wife and his sister about conversion. And they want to go with their people on the deportation. And my grandfather eventually says, you were free to go, but you're not going to take any of your children. The 5 children, including my mother and my great aunt's 5 children, will have to stay with him, my grandfather. And at that point, they gave up the argument and they decided to stay. And the next day, they converted to Islam and took Turkish identity. And it was clear also to the authorities there that these were not real converts, because there's many comments in the memoirs about the fact that we don't we know that you did this to survive, but we're looking to the next generation, and they're trying to work with with my mother's generation to make sure that they become Turks and not Armenians.
I think you must set an example with good timekeeping, and I can see that the tea is taking shape.
This lady's being tried.
I'm so sorry. Okay, one more question, please.
Thank you. Armin, I just wondered if you'd say a bit more about your working with the partners in Turkey that you've mentioned a few times. And sometimes during your talk, you talked about your project as we doing X or Y. And it's a tremendous amount of very sustained work over many years for one person to do, but also the impact that you're having in Turkey, I think, is helped by the partners. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yes, well, I started working with Osman Kavala of Anadolu Kultur, which is an NGO that has this particular space and has worked both in Istanbul and in the eastern regions in Diyarbakir. They without his support and the people that work under him, and I could give you a list of half a dozen or more names, none of this would have taken place. He's put his personal fortune into this process, and others have been supportive in more quiet ways because of the pressure that sometimes the government can exert if you're publicly in the front of this. But I've been also surprised by individuals who I thought would be more resistant. This summer when I visited Merzifon and met the mayor, he was recently elected from the CHP, not the AKP party. He was very supportive of these memory sites, and he thought it was important that the Armenians and their role in this community be recognized. Clearly, we're not putting up plaques about the genocide per se, but we're putting up plaques about the presence and what had happened to the Armenians. So there's a sort of political negotiation having to go on with this. But they are all very courageous, and I'm hoping things will go well with the election on November 1st, and that it's important, I think, for Turkey to have multiple voices and multiple parties. I think it strengthens their democracy. I don't think one party being in the majority for decades and decades is the solution. I think other voices need to be brought to the table, and I'm hoping that will happen with this election. It happened on June 7th with the prior election. And we're hoping that those numbers can stay roughly the same, so that the HDP can have a voice in the government, and that the CHP, which seems to be progressing quicker than the AKP, which is strange because it was the other way around. CHP is the Kemalist party. I've learned a lot about Turkish politics over the years, which I never thought I would ever do, but it's in part with working with people who are courageous, and they take many more risks than I do. People ask me, are you afraid? And I say, not really, but I'm more afraid for my friends there.
Well, it's wonderful to conclude on that note of cooperation and hope for the future, and I think this has been a wonderful opening session, and may I ask you to thank both of our speakers and then take your tea.
Any questions?
Well, I'm prompted to ask a question after seeing the slides of the Turkish newspapers. And I was wondering, what were the Turkish newspapers reporting in 1915? Don't forget that in April 1915 there had been the Gallipoli campaign, and there might be a close link between the Gallipoli campaign and what happened to the Armenians subsequently. But what were the Turkish newspapers reporting, if anything, about the Armenians in April, May, June 1915?
Actually, they were reporting nothing because there was a state censorship.
so they didn't have even the chance to write something about the Armenian deportation or massacres.
Yes, please.
I also have a question regarding this last presentation. Did you say that these were Armenian newspapers writing after the war in Turkey, reporting on how many? Do you have any impression of how many newspapers are we talking about, and were they, in a way, set up again? Were these old newspapers that were sort of stopped reporting and then were set up again, or did they report throughout? Well, I can't imagine that they reported.
Yeah, they managed to report throughout the armistice period from 1918 to 1923, and there were like more than 10 Armenian newspapers only in Istanbul, published in Istanbul, 2 newspapers in Izmir, and as far as I know, 2 newspapers in Adana region, Cilicia, and they were all reporting about these, these events, as far as I know.
And they then closed shop in 1922 or 1923, or
no, they continued until 1923, until the announcement of the Republic of Turkey.
But some continued after 1920. Jana.
Yeah. Jamanak and also Jagadamart continued like 2 years, but we have, Jamanak published even today. So it's like 100th anniversary. It is still being published in Istanbul, but only one day, Jamanak.
I think we didn't stress the fact that the Constantinople community was pretty much left alone. There were some deportations, but there was no general deportation of the capital, Istanbul, and in the case of Izmir as well. There were actually 2 exceptions during the war, so the communities continued through the war.
Thank you very much. Can I ask, because you mentioned the relationship or the parallel lives between the Armenian and Greek communities in Turkey. Is there any kind of communication between the 2, or is it the Armenian community deals with the Armenian problems and there is no kind of...
I do not think that there was a communication between Turkish and Armenian and Greek communities. I didn't find anything about their relations, and I don't know actually how to look Greek newspapers of that period, and so that's why I don't know if they have any relationship between Greeks and Armenians.
Just a footnote to the Greeks. It was the case that some of the eyewitness accounts of what happened in 1915 were given by Greeks to the Western sources. There are Greek professors who left Marsavan who wound up in the report in the Blue Book. So, there was some, since the Greeks were not being persecuted in 1915-16, but many of them also realized that it wasn't going to be very easy for them to remain. They had left parts of the Anatolia and went to Constantinople and brought these accounts.
Graham Dawson, it's a question for Ara about I wanted to ask you about the image that you ended with, which was the erasure of the settlement, of the town, into this kind of rural space. And you made the point about erasure as a kind of strategy within genocide, the destruction of the buildings. It struck me that in contrast to Ahmed, where we were seeing houses, you traced his house and people living there, but also there were the churches that had survived, and it seemed that there was something different going on. And I wondered, given that you mentioned there was something like 2,000, I think, different communities being displaced and destroyed, whether you could say a little bit more about that process and whether it was systematic or whether it took different forms and different...
You mean the physical destruction?
The physical destruction and the eradication of the
Right.
traces in the landscape of the Armenian presence in the buildings, that destruction is very different from being taken up and used again in different kinds
Right.
of ways.
I think even in Marzafan, I think most of the churches were destroyed. A few of them were kept, often because they serve a public purpose, same in Urfa and such places, but for the most part, they've either fallen disrepair, sometimes they've been, because they're good structures, so that they use for practical purposes, but there are also cases where structures have been dynamited deliberately. So Arakelos Monastery, one of the oldest structures in Mush, was dynamited in the 60s. There's one in Anik, on the Armenian border, contemporary. So the state, but it seems that it's usually local initiative. But what is true is that the state does not protect any of these locations, and it allows it to fall into disrepair. Village names are changed. Usually crosses are certainly taken off. That's visibly Armenian. It's part of what do you call it? Landscaping modern Turkey, where you do not want to see what remains of Armenians as a matter of course. But that's part of the genocidal process. Only recently the Turkish state has resorted to tokenism, so they're now renovating some places. The significant exception is Subgiragos, because the local council, the local municipality, it's a Kurdish municipality, it's a matter of policy. It's a very important case study actually, where they participate in renovating an Armenian church themselves, they still take care of it. And this whole idea of compensation to Armenians, they even addressed that problem, where what they said was, we cannot give you properties that your church owned before the war, before 1915, or after 1915, but they compensated the church by giving them land of equivalent value outside. So there was even the whole idea of restitution, rebuilding churches. Turkey is going through this phase where there are different experiments going. The state is trying to control the debate, tokenism, then the local authorities have their own ideas, and where it pans out we don't know, but most churches have been destroyed within Turkey. I would say 95% are destroyed. I've done a survey of the Ahtamar area when they renovated Ahtamar, and of 20 such churches, more than half, there's absolutely no trace of them whatsoever, and the rest are, maybe 8 of them are in very bad ruins, and about 2 of them are pretty much, have got more than just 2 walls and some of the roofs standing. And these are medieval churches we're talking about, cultural heritage of the area. And this is part of, it hasn't been resolved because they still don't have protection. Armenian antiquities do not have protection in Turkey today. That's a categorical statement we can make.
So you use the word tokenism, and I quite understand why you use that. But at the same time, especially in the Kurdish regions, there's a kind of movement taking place. Now, do you anticipate or do you notice any signs that within, as it were, mainstream Turkish historiography or Turkish archaeologists, that there is a movement in the direction that you would like to see that movement?
Yes, Kurdish areas, nobody seems to deny the Armenian genocide in my experience, partly because of their own experience as being victims of Turkish nationalism, so there's a major change there, which is why it's easy to work in those parts of the world. And southeastern Turkey, it's pretty much, they believe the opposite of whatever the state tells them. It's almost the other extreme. Armenians are superhumans, they can do everything, they built up all of Diyarbakir. It's not entirely true either, but they compensate, and they say, and partly because they say because of what we did to Armenians, and it's unequivocal. Contrition does work. You do see contrition in southeastern Turkey, and that can be emulated in other parts of Turkey as well. And that feeds into the whole idea of reconciliation. And there are successful cases in southeastern Turkey. So.
I just wanted to ask a question because you were talking about missionaries being foreign missionaries, and I just wondered because America wasn't in the war in 1915, and I just wondered what the American reaction was because it must have been reported back what was happening. So what was the reaction to it?
Okay, I worked
there was one.
Well, there was one. There was a debate within the American embassy where the Morgenthau, the ambassador, won out. His position was that we should stay put and try and publicize what happened to Armenians by releasing this information which is what the Americans did to the press, and raise money and support as many victims they can within the Ottoman Empire and outside. And there was a guy called Louis Einstein who was a State Department employee, and he said he was of the view that the Americans should break diplomatic relations on account of the Armenian issue. So it's a major, within the embassy, it was debated. But I think Morgenthau won out, and one reason that Armenians do survive today is because of the United States. The United States played a critical role. I mean, you talk about the orphans, they also collected orphans after the war. In fact, in Carpet, they tried to have an orphanage, which the nationalist Turks closed down. But they supported tens of thousands of Armenian orphans in the Armenian Republic. The United States played a creditable role in this whole issue, which is still not really recognized, or it should be. And missionaries also, many of them died. Many of them died helping Armenians from typhus by working with these victims. Of course, they had religious conviction, and they stayed put, and they knew what they were doing was important.
And the United States never entered the war against Turkey.
They never declared war, partly because they want to stay there.
I have a question maybe for Ara Sarafian, but maybe for other people as well. In terms of latest research, and probably also, even more importantly, memory. Is there, I mean, we're talking about the Armenian genocide, and for good reason, but of course it was integrated into, if you like, greater assault on Christian communities in this region before 1914 and after 1917 or 1918, and obviously Armenians are sort of by far the largest population that was targeted and killed, but then of course you just mentioned Greek populations, we have Assyrians and so on, other Christian minorities who were sometimes equally in a way destroyed as a group, or at least then targeted and deported after 1917. Is there sort of an attempt in terms of research, but also memory and coming to terms with what happened then now, uniting these stories? And when I think about, as a director of this Armenian Institute, is there sort of an attempt to unite what you're saying and integrate it into whatever the stories that other minorities, Christian minorities, that sometimes at least underwent through a similar experience, putting these together? Or is it still, in a way, everybody's fighting on his or her own?
Okay, good question. Until the 1970s, the Armenian issue was a taboo. Legally, you couldn't really discuss it in Turkey. There was an official Turkish position. 1980s, they tried to revamp the official position. By the year 2002, Turkey became much more democratic for a number of reasons, and many doors were open. It was possible to make a presentation of the Armenian issue within Turkey. We as an organization started working inside of Turkey, openly, that we work on the Armenian genocide. I went to conferences, and you can see that difference. Today, some of the best work on the Armenian genocide is done by Turkish scholars. It's part of their history, they're interested, they identify with the victims, and so it's already changing. It's not Armenians doing Armenian history, we collectively work together. My most important colleagues are actually Turkish ethnicity. I'm not even aware that Turkish sometimes, because we talk with it, like Osman Kokai, you know, because it's a common history that we share. So the environment is changing. The denial camp is still there. In fact, it's interesting in Turkey because even while the state is changing its narrative, the Turkish Historical Society, which is Kemalist organization, has its own funding. It's self-sustaining, and this is part of the problem. They're producing their PhDs, they're pushing their own agenda, and so now within Turkey, the battle is within Turkey for Turkish hearts and minds, and that's where we come in. And it's not Turks against Armenians anymore. It's a question of people of different approaches to history, some from an ideological perspective, others from a moral and academic perspective. But it's changed radically within Turkey. I mean, the best work is done. I put it very clearly. I do not know any smart deniers. All right? There are no smart deniers. The smart people in Turkey are unequivocally working on genocide issues because the facts are there. So there is a process of change going on, and we're part of that.
Could I just specify my question? I think it was not quite my question. My question is more, we haven't really talked about sort of the most interesting question, that is, why did it happen? We said, at some points, well, it's sort of a little bit irrational and whatever. I'm not quite sure whether this really hits the point. But when we talk about why it's happened, you could probably argue that it was a sort of a nation-building process, where these minorities that seemed to threaten the Turkish state or the sort of emerging Turkish state were targeted. That, of course, did not just fit the Armenian minority. Also, other Christian minorities also didn't seem to fit into this sort of new vision of what Turkey could be. Greeks, Assyrians, Chaldeans, and so on. So Christian minorities that were also targeted, sometimes with a very similar effect, meaning the total destruction of the respective minority. And the question now is there sort of an attempt in historiography, but also in memory, where these stories are brought together? So where we're no longer talking just about the Armenian genocide, but actually about sort of a sort of concerted effort to eradicate minorities that didn't seem to fit this new vision of the new Turkish state.
Look, when you say minorities don't fit in the new Turkish state, I said a paradigm, but I would also include Bosnians and Kurds and Arabs within that. They wouldn't necessarily kill, but their memory was also erased. I mean, they would say, you are Turks now, you will speak Kurdish, you will not speak Albanian or Bosniak or Circassian. I mean, there's all, and that's also a genocidal process. You're not murdering these people, but you're taking their identities away and you're forcing them to become this entity that is an ideological construct. The Turkish state ideology comes first, then they create the state, and then they try and create people. Some people don't fit in really well, like Armenians and Greeks, because they're so different. So they're treated a different way. But the concept of molding people to fit an ideology, an ideological construct, applies to a whole range of people. And this is being discussed in Turkey today. The Kurdish problem is part of that. I mean, telling the Kurds there's no such thing as Kurd, there's no such thing as Kurdish language. You know, you speak a mixture of Arabic and Turkish. You know, you are mountain Turks. I mean, this we joke about it today, but this was a reality. Turkey until 1980s and 1990s. This is what the Kurdish movement is about. The PKK, to be blunt about it. This is part of their struggle too. So Turkey is trying to grapple with these issues. Turkey has an identity problem, and it still hasn't. Even look at elections today. Even within elections, it's being reflected based on ethnicity and also religion. I live in the Sunni business too. So there is all these unresolved issues that the state tried to impose from top down that still hasn't been resolved. And the Armenians is part of that.
Well, I was just going to add, that I think part of the question is, are scholars working together? And I think yes, but more so in the States than here, as near as I can tell. But that's partly because there are Chaldean and Assyrian diasporas more there than here, and so you have more work being done with descendants in those places. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yes, there's more work being done. It's not always for the better. I mean, we have our own issues that we need to resolve. There's ideologies coming into play. But the best work, I think, is being done in Turkey. I think
I'm not arguing with that.
But there are attempts.
Adding that there is work being done with other people.
Yeah, and within the genocide studies community, the Armenian genocide is now put in the context of the genocide against the Christian minorities. So you find even in some of the textbooks, Armenian genocide isn't identified uniquely, but it's the Christian minorities. And then also you have a lot of scholarship being done about the Greeks, because the Greeks were singled out in a certain way along the Aegean coast prior to 1915 and were moved from Greek communities away from what was perceived to be a threat from Greece and the Allies. And then, of course, in that period that you're describing, 1918 to the fall of Izmir in 1922, the Pontic Greeks underwent a significant massacres in that Black Sea region, and many of the surviving Armenians who returned to these communities were caught up in those massacres. In particular, in Marzavan, about 3,000 Armenians were there in by 1920, and most of those were killed. Most of those Armenians, along with the Greeks, were killed in July of 1921. So 3,000 individuals lost their lives in that.
Killed by nationalist forces.
Yes, by Topal Osman.
Well, can I just ask, do you think it was a popular movement in Turkey, or was it just centrally
The genocide,
organised.
you mean?
Yeah. Action against the Armenians.
I think people participate in genocide for different reasons. I think the state regulated the actual killing, but I wouldn't necessarily say it was popular, but a lot of people participated, whether it's your rapist or your, or the thief for economic reasons. I mean, there are different reasons why people are co-opted into the system. They were rewarded for what they did. There's a history of communal violence, of course, in that part of the world as well. So I think the state played a key role in regulating them and channeling the genocidal process.
My question is about identity. We talked about identity, and I'm interested in Aris's work as well as Aras. Changing attitude in the Armenians themselves, as well as in Turkish people, especially with regard to people who were converted to Islam and who are now coming out, who are wanting to accept Christianity again, be rebaptized. Can you tell us a little bit more, Aris, about the changes that are taking place within the Armenian community with regard to...
For example, Dersim Armenians, it's named Tunceli town in Turkey. They were generally Armenians converted to Islam. They lived as Muslims, as Turkish or no, as Kurdish people, but now they recently organized a foundation to return their real religion, and now they say that they are Armenians, not Kurdish or not Islam, Muslim. So I can say that recently there have been improvements in Turkish society, and it is possible to argue about Armenian genocide in Turkey. Of course, you cannot discuss in religious or conservative towns like Sivas, in Elazığ, in Erzurum, but you can discuss and organize a conference on Armenian genocide in Istanbul, in Ankara, in Izmir.
I'm a bit uncomfortable with it. You refer to being converting back, but there are also Muslim Armenians today as a reality. They don't want to convert back, but they identify themselves as Armenian or part Armenian, because many are mixed, they're Kurdish Armenian. So there's a whole gray area that I'm very careful not to alienate because they're part of any future solution. There are now Muslim Armenians. Some call themselves dönmes, converts. Some are genuine Muslims, and in a free society, they should choose who they are. So this is something new. The idea that ethnicity and religion have to be identical doesn't necessarily fit, and I think we should be careful how we turn that.
May I add to that there were Muslim Armenians in Syria, and actually the church in Derzor was reaching out to them and communicating with them and celebrating. So that was something that was happening in Derzor, and the impetus was actually coming from the church towards those Muslim Armenians, not to try to get them to convert, but to accept them and to celebrate them as Armenians.
Sorry, please raise your hand.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Simon.
Ara, seeing the sort of significant changes in the Turkish attitudes and public attitude, do you connect it with the Hrant Dink's murder? Can you elaborate on that?
Well, before the murder, Hrant Dink stood for reconciliation. People forget what he actually said, but I think that's why he was murdered, because he was effective, because ordinary Turks responded well to him. He spoke of the genocide without being hateful. Maybe that is why he was murdered, and he became a symbol, and a lot of people feel guilty as well. So yes, it became a major turning point, and the name keeps coming up. Yes. He represents the best of Turks and Armenians as well. So in that sense, it's positive.
Well, I think, just if I may say about Hrant, that he was a great representative of the Armenian people, and particularly for the reconciliation between Turkey and Armenia. And I think there's a very poignant anecdote about him that, when France put on the law against, that prison anybody who denied the Holocaust would go into prison, or anybody who denied genocide would go into prison. I said that, well, I will go to France and say that it is a genocide, but when I go to Turkey, I will not say that it's a genocide. And he was, he was a great man, great man. It was a privilege to know. So, we've only got a few more minutes. Any questions?
Following on from the question about identity, and perhaps looking at it in a roundabout way, in that my understanding is that he wanted everybody to be co-citizens and to be able to be equal and citizens of a country rather than subjects. And my question is, we've been talking about identity here today, but nobody's mentioned the millet system, which in terms of memory is something throughout the Middle East that still persists today in terms of thinking of oneself. I would disagree with the first speaker today, but I'm an anthropologist, I know there's no such thing as race, and ethnicity is self-described and so on. But people there do think of themselves as quite different groups, and this also links in the question about the Assyrians and Chaldeans. Armenians think of themselves as quite exceptional, but in that regard, we're different. We governed this way for so many years. I'm kind of surprised that the word millet didn't come up today at all. Just
right.
I don't know if that's a question or a comment.
It was a way of defining the communities, defined by
religious
their
affiliation
religions and their religious leaders.
I mean, yes, I refer to Apostolic, Catholic, and Protestant Armenians. I didn't say Muslim Armenians, but yes, it was legally defined status, where they recognize you in terms of religion rather than ethnicity. In fact, there was a point at which Catholic Armenians did not consider themselves to be Armenian. I mean, that's how far it went. Religion is part of heritage from Ottoman time, and that's what I guess we're trying to break today. That idea. Related to this, we also need to change. It's very good to preach Turks need to be changed, but Armenians also need to change. Within Turkey, in Turkey they call the white Turks and black Turks. The white Turks are the Istanbul Turks, the Europeans. The black Turks are the Anatolians, the barbarians. But there's a parallel with Armenians. There are the white Armenians of Istanbul, and if you go to eastern provinces, there are the black Armenians. They'll tell you, we are the black Armenians. We are not accepted for who we are because we don't speak Armenian or because we're Muslim. So there's a lot of healing or looking in the mirror, a process that needs to take place. So history does matter, and awareness of this issue does matter. This is all the legacy of the genocide, and I see the only way forward is through a democratic context. If Turkey becomes a democratic state, you can resolve these issues. But right now it's not, or it's half democracy. We see which way it continues after the next election. But there are substantial issues where Turks need to change, but also Armenians need to change. And there's a lot one can say about that, maybe not on this forum, but there's a lot that needs to be said.
Yeah, a question for Ara. Just going back to deniers and work, it sounds like they're not academics, but obviously still take the time to speak to them. So I'm just wondering what process is in trying to get them to see the truth.
Okay. A denier, by definition, is not somebody who doesn't agree with you. A denier is, by definition, somebody who knows what the score is and avoids engaging the score. So a denier will never acknowledge the existence of American missionary sources. So Justin McCarthy was an American denier, never engages these sources in their own right. He would say, missionaries are by definition liars, they're Christian, they're anti-Muslim. It's a way of not engaging the whole corpus of evidence, if you will. So you can't change their mind because they know what the score is. There are some people who read that material and believe it and reproduce it, so, which is why I engaged in Irish historiography, because many people in Turkey who repeat the official line actually believe it's true. So not challenging deniers in Turkish as well, in a sense you're leaving the field open for the deniers to manipulate the vast majority of Turks, where they have a stronger voice anyway. But the deniers themselves know what the score is. What we're doing is the contest is for the hearts and minds of ordinary Turks, and to point out to them that your state is telling you porkies basically. And since Turkey has changed in the last 10-15 years, Now we can take the whole process into Turkey itself and make those presentations. As you were doing it with Marzifan, with your work, in my case more academic work, but what we do does matter because I think we are gaining ground. I think so academia has a role to play in all this.
So perhaps
Can I just ask one quick question? Is there anything that either of you would suggest Armenians in the UK could do as a positive contribution to getting the genocide recognised or discussing it openly? Is there one thing that Armenians in this country or in the diaspora could do, in your view, that could help more people understand the genocide? I mean, do you think politically, or I'm asking, you know, what you think would be the best way, somebody here, to further that debate?
I mean, I would say reconciliate with the Turkish community here in the United Kingdom.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
Sorry,
Reconciliate Turks in this country actively.
Yeah.
There's a large Turkish community. We can show by example, do what we preach to do in Turkey, we can also do here. I think the Turkish community is open for that, the Kurdish community is open for that, we just haven't tried. I think we can also be more critical of ourselves. I think I would start there and allow criticism to take place so that we have a much more gentle way of approaching these issues rather than accusatory, because the Armenian issue is politicized. We haven't touched on that, but it's also a political instrument that is used by states. I almost understand why sometimes Turks even deny, because if you look at worst case scenarios, I mean, there are Armenians who advocate the dismemberment of Turkey, you know, this and the other. It's a ridiculous position, but now we need to be careful what's being said in our name and say so openly.
I think on that note, I think you're absolutely right. It's a very slow process, but it will succeed. And maybe on that note we should end the session. I believe there's reception downstairs?
We're moving downstairs, yeah.
We've got an hour, I think we'll meet again at 7 o'clock.
Thanks very much.